Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session, Tabletop Exercises, Improving Your Practice for Better Incident Response, or perhaps I should say, ahoy! If you aren't aware, today is National Talk Like a Pirate Day here in the US. So please feel free if you would like to phrase your questions in the form of pirate speak. I will be happy to interpret that when we do get to a Q&A. I will go ahead and pass it over. Amanda, introduce yourself to folks, and what are we talking about today?
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Amanda Berlin, and I'm the Director of Incident Detection Engineering here at Blumira. And I've been at Blumira since the beginning. It's a great company, and we do SIM stuff for small and medium businesses. And I have my awesome co-presenter slash first mate, or maybe you're the captain because you're wearing a hat. Jeremy, go for it.
Yeah, so my name's Jeremy Mio. I work leading large local government cyber operations. I've also been in the Fortune 500 space doing cybersecurity and also have some other software endeavors. So happy to be here. I've led incident response and tabletop exercises nationwide, and excited to get through and get all the bounties we can throughout this.
All right, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So, like Zoe said, this is tabletop exercises, improving your practice for better incident response. What better day to do it on than talk with, although I'm going to take this off because it's really disorienting to talk with an eye patch on, whether it's on my glasses or not. So yeah, what better day to do it than on Talk Like Pirate Day? So you'll see, we like the themes. So here we go. These are a couple of things that we're going to be going over. So we like to cover the overview of what tabletops are and the concepts behind them and why they're important and do's and don'ts and kind of structuring programs, all of that kind of stuff. They're super important when talking about incident response in general, and we'll get into that. We'll go into what components are in a really good tabletop exercise and program, and what you should use to build it. We'll go over some common pitfalls and some stuff that you want to avoid. And then also how to design different scenarios to test your IR capabilities, your detection capabilities, and potentially your compliance. So just imagine you have, there's a suspicious connection discovered on your email server to the Black Pearl, right? Because even though you're on a ship, how else are you going to, talk back and forth remotely with your other fleet of pirates? But further investigation discovers a web shell commonly called argmatey and potentially privileged access to administrative accounts. And how would you respond? Jeremy, you want to take it?
Yeah, so going from there, like what are we doing here, right? So we have a potential privileged access to administrator accounts. Do you know how many administrative accounts you have? Do you have the ability to isolate? What other components are connected to this email server? Do you have any type of regulatory data? There are a lot of things to think about. So, do we investigate further? Is the web shell bad? Is it, potentially some type of unscheduled maintenance? Maybe it's scheduled maintenance, depending on how your change control or any type of your, maintenance processes function. So, a lot of things to kind of go through here, a lot of ways that this can go in different directions. And that's why we have to think about all of the potential items that may be within a playbook or within some of our incident response processes.
Okay. So we'll move on to scenario discussions. So these are some things that we like to include with tabletops. and a little bit of an example like of what Jeremy was talking about. And it's really good when you're going into a tabletop like that to come up with different scenarios that you can talk about afterwards.
Right. So going through some of these, I mentioned some of these discussions you want to kind of focus, and we'll go through, how to structure your tabletop exercises to be very focused and direct. A lot of tabletops will last very long, and you'll, only be able to do them so many times with the amount of time it will take all of the staff. But if you do some of these smaller tabletop exercises, you can find that they're a little bit more productive in the time they take if you focus them very, very specific. A lot of these can spin out of control and go down all kinds of different paths, but it's good to have these kind of discussion points, so you don't, get taken over by the monkey pirate there. The other thing to kind of note here, and we'll go through a little bit more in some of the other slides, is having some type of compliance or regulatory functions tied to your tabletop scenarios and keep track of those. So you can see some of the NIST functions for the NIST 800-53 and the NIST CFS, or the NIST cybersecurity framework functions, is that you can kind of start to identify which ones you're covering. Now, a lot of scenarios will cover a gamut of functions throughout any compliance or standards framework, but you want to focus on specific ones and then keep track of those when you go through your tabletop program, and you can start to see and do a gap analysis on what things are you covering, what things are you not covering. Maybe you're purposely not covering them because you don't have that type of function or risk at your area or your organization. But those are the things you can start to gather as you start to record all these data points. So going through some of these, how do you find out the capabilities of web shells? Do you have that type of auditing and deep understanding and analysis of the system that was affected? Do you have how much logging are you doing there? Also, can you identify all the accounts? Is it being used enterprise wide? Can you restrict them? How do you are there any vulnerabilities exploited? Do you have some type of registry with that? Is it combined with with other types of security stack that you might have? And you can keep going down through these, like, what's the level of response for criticals? Is email or this specific email system a critical system? It probably is for a lot of organizations. It might not be for some that are not heavily dependent on email. So those are things to think about, especially when you go into the next discussion point of, do you potentially decommission it if it's that bad? If you think about the exchange vulnerabilities with some of the things that were happening there, do you just take email offline? And a lot of organizations did do that. And then obviously, as any scenario and any lessons learned, how do you prevent this from happening again? So that's the kind of question you're always going to ask yourself, and we'll go through how to record some of those things as well.
Definitely. And one of the other things that we won't get into too much in this video in the series, we'll get into this a little bit later, but you can actually use the IR frameworks to go through different sections of, detection, response, eradication, all of the different steps that you normally do in an incident response steps, and come up with different discussions and map to that, right? So that you're essentially trying to hit different parts of where you're covered in your program in general. All right, so goals and objectives. We'd like to break this out into like the minimum viable, what you probably should start out with, right? So you can take, obviously, these goals and objectives and make an entire program out of it. We don't have time to do all of that today, just because this is only going to be like 45-ish minutes. But this is the basis of starting that tabletop and tabletop program. So one of the main things you would want to do is break that scenario into meaningful learning points. So if we go back, if I can do this without messing up, we go back, we have the scenario here, but we on the back end would want to have the actual goal and learning points of what we want to accomplish with the scenario, right? And some of our scenario discussion points would lead to that, but that's one of the main things that you want to do when you're designing it is come up with those different learning points and what you're actually trying to focus on, right? Jeremy, do you want to keep going on those? And
Yeah, so what, like, just a quick, example of that is some, when you go through, I'm going to kind of skip a little here. When you have that discussion page, you want to facilitate a conversation based on those instant response talking points. Whatever your instant response methodology is, the one that we have here is the, summary of the NIST framework, but you just focus on one or two of those, right? So sometimes places will do a tabletop scenario, and as much as you can go through all of the cybersecurity steps and the containment and the analysis and all those things that we think about when we think about incident response, but a lot just start with that communication portion. Who do you communicate to? Focus on the communication plan. Who do you escalate to? How do you escalate? How do you explain things to upper management or to the executive? And just like just focus on that first versus, trying to understand the type of, web auditing logs and how to contain, some type of, sophisticated or unsophisticated attack, because communication is going to be your first thing that you should focus on. And it's probably something that we all need to focus on a little bit more. So that's just kind of an example of where you can just focus it down, just the communication. That helps a lot of organizations break down those barriers across teams, even within the IT departments, let alone cross department to legal or HR or wherever else that may go. Another thing is the read it loud and clear for all to hear, right? So we always are taught to not read directly from the slides, but for the scenarios, you want to read it clearly. You want to read those discussion points and really just make sure that everyone understands the scenarios. That is something that you do want to do, and make sure that everyone understands the scenario. But overall, our objective is to have that productive and engaging discussion, right? So you want to ultimately identify whatever gaps or organizational needs, and be able to prioritize those, and get management buy-in there. So you want to just have a productive and engaging discussion. You may want to start with something that hits close to home in your specific team. I know Amanda has a few techniques on where to start with some initial tabletop exercises.
yeah, so one of the first ones I ever did was super quick. We had zero program. I didn't know all of the things that I know now about tabletop exercises, but it was just coming from a standpoint of, I think this is a risk for us. We should walk through it and see what we would do if this were potentially an issue here, right? That was a long time ago. Another good example of that is when like we were around when we were first founded, we were all working remote, and we were really, really early company. So we didn't have, we had like 10 people. So we didn't really have the, time or any budget to like put in anything super fancy, right? There was 10 of us. You don't really need to have full-blown tabletop program like you would in an actual like either enterprise organization or even somebody that has 50 or more employees, when it starts to get a little bit hairier and you're not just sitting next to everybody. But just starting out really super simple, and we just did it in Slack, right? So my example was, what happens if somebody breaks into my house and steals my laptop that's logged in to all of the things we have our like proprietary information in. So even just like a scenario, not necessarily that we were worried about that happening, but it's a really good starting point to even get yourself familiar with the exercises.
and when you're doing these things, there's some things you want to, do, and then some things you don't want to do, right? So you want to have one single person, individual to facilitate. That person may rotate, but and maybe that's a good way to get some other experience for certain people that lead certain meetings. So it's kind of a good test, and kind of something that somebody might take a lot of pride in. But you do want to have one person facilitate. You don't want to try to be being the security person, also facilitating, also responding to every question, and then having a bunch of other IT, help desk or engineers just listening to you. You don't want to do that. A lot of places that ends up happening. So you want to try to get it and a little bit more, and maybe get a scenario that is outside of something the security team directly is responsible for, or something like that.
Right.
Other things is, as you start building, you want to, get other applicable members throughout. So, I would suggest just with IT at first, and then you can start building and getting different individuals, like a legal or like an HR. I mean, that kind of, sometimes goes without saying, but it takes a while to build that up and get those relationships up. And then also keep track, right? You want to keep track for the discussion guide. We have some, things in the later webinars that we'll share. We'll talk about a little here, where you can start to track some of these things and have some short-term goals, some long-term goals, or just, have a list of, backlog tasks.
Yeah. And then we get to the don'ts. So there's always things that you want to keep in mind that we've seen come across in tabletop programs and have become kind of like just a little bit more common, right? They're not all the time, but you're definitely straying away from the exercise and scope creep. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of people have heard in meetings, well, you call it a bunch of different things, right? Some people call it a parking lot, some people call it brown bagging. It's the let's talk about this later because we're going down a rabbit hole that doesn't necessarily help us towards our goal that we're trying to accomplish with this tabletop. And that happens a lot because once you get into those discussion points, and depending on who you have in the room, right, it could go a million different directions, right? You go down the path of, well, we can't get alerted from that because last year we never got the budget for it. We never got the budget for it because of X, Y, and Z. So we should go fix that problem. And it kind of just gets away from the whole point of it. So having a point either on your discussion sheet, or it's definitely something that you should let everybody in that is involved in the tabletop know that happens. It's okay to happen, and anybody should feel empowered to speak up and be like, is that where we want to go with this? Can we come back to that later, kind of thing? And that really helps keep it focused on the task at hand, kind of. Forgetting to completing the AAR and following up. So AAR is after action report. It is a form that you can fill out, or as you're going through the tabletop, sometimes people start to fill it out then, where you kind of keep track of the different methods that you went about, the different frameworks you use, the different procedures that you've used. If you have any run books or playbooks, different things that need to be changed, or action items that you need to do when you leave the meeting. It's not difficult to document that when you're in the room, but having an action to follow up on those things, right? And actually do something with what you came out of the entire exercise with. Because a lot of times, you're in the meeting, you did the thing, then that's it. It never goes anywhere after that. Just make sure to follow up, whether you have to create another meeting to, hold everybody accountable, or you create tickets for it, or whatever it is. It's a really important part that sometimes is overlooked. And then the last one is being that person. What we mean by that is, I'm sure we've all worked with somebody that is, always right. They think that they're always right. Their stuff never breaks. They want to play devil's advocate on every twist and turn. That's not super helpful. It is it is helpful to be devil's advocate when it comes to a lot of stuff in tabletops, but when you are aggressively so, or it just really throws off the entire workflow of what a tabletop should look like. It should be equal responsibility and representation from all the teams and people there, and it shouldn't just be one person controlling it and saying where it goes. Some moderators can be like that too, right? So if you're facilitating it, just make sure that you're staying on track, you're following the dues, and you know, hopefully you don't end up having anybody that's super argumentative in one of those tabletops. All right. Next up.
And Amanda, if you had somebody like that, how would you combat that?
So that's yeah. So we have run into that a couple times, and what I found works is kind of eating your own dog food, right? So pick something that you're in charge of, and show, even if you think it's not possible, what if it was, right? So like, I'm gonna call myself out. I turned off my pager and turned off my phone and turned off all the alerts to everything and left for a month. Just throwing something out there that puts the limelight on you, and you can work through that and show that it's like okay to come up with answers for those things. It makes it a lot easier for others that may not like doing that to do it in the future.
Yeah, so when we're talking about, the next part about planning out the tabletop exercise program, the goals and objectives, what's the frequency? You can't just do one of these things and never do it again. A lot of organizations end up putting a lot of work into doing a multiple day or a whole week tabletop exercise. They do it once and then they either never do it again or they only do it annually, and they have a bunch of action items and never get back to them. So you really want to think about the frequency and length of your program. You want to build one out at least 6 months out, and then you want to review your overall scope. Start small. You don't want to do some really complex scenario with a lot of moving parts. A lot of organizations will either not get a lot of backing from executive management. They'll fail real hard, and there will be a lot of other things that come from that. So you really want to think about that scope and then build a frequency and length out. So some of the suggestions we have is creating an official charter, right? Getting some sponsored sign off at the highest level. You might not go all the way up, but definitely getting that security lead or the IT lead. And as I just mentioned, starting small with a limited scope, you want frequent. So these 15 minutes, 1 hour exercises can, go a lot farther than trying to organize multiple, hours or days and things like that. You do want to align a lot of your stuff to some type of control framework. It will make auditing easier afterwards. It will also make you feel a lot more organized, show the organization to the higher level, and be able to show your overall roadmap, as well as if you have a lot of other security assessments or audits that you're trying to address, you can start to work tabletop items to fill those gaps. Other things is that you want to make sure you have those remediation plans in place. We talked a little bit about the after action report, and we'll go more in depth in some of the other webinars about that. But you want to have that remediation roadmap and sign off, and make sure you're recording them, make sure you get management sign off, and making sure they don't go into a black hole. Another thing that we recommend is there's a lot of meetings. Everyone, despises meetings. You want to hook into those other meetings. There might already be review processes for engineering, some other management meetings where they discuss escalations, or even some type of change control meeting. You can hook into those meetings and just get 5 or 10 minutes within those, and not go a lot farther with just covering 1 or 2. You don't want to have to cover all of the items that you have in a remediation plan, but just covering the top 2. And that's why you want to prioritize and get that sign off.
Yeah, and there's a good going back to the difficult to deal with people sometimes in group settings. There's a good point in one of the Q&As that so oftentimes when that happens in their experience, it's because the person saying those things, like the confrontational person, believes that they know more than the person who wrote the slides. And they say, I tend to fix it by asking what would happen if that person were away on holiday, on a plane, etc., and how would everyone else handle it? It's a great point. The tabletops that Jeremy and I have run, that always happens, right? Because whether you're taking a training and you need to leave for like an actual incident at work, or all of those things are more important than just pretend like the tabletop itself, right? So many times we have people leave, and you can use that to your advantage in the tabletop program also. So like, as a moderator facilitator, you can say, all right, something happened and that person is no longer here. Like, I probably wouldn't do that after a heated argument or anything, because it's almost like you're being grounded. But yeah, it's a great point to say, and you could do that again with anybody in the room or somebody that's not in the room, because a lot of times we'll also hear, oh, well, when that happens, I just call so and so, or I just put in a ticket with this support system or whatever. Right. Yeah, that's a great point, is to just kind of work that into the scenario. All right, next slide.
All right, so creating these tabletops is more of an art than a science, right? So you can, we talked about focusing items on internal risks, audits, frameworks, a lot of, things that you need to work on, right? That would make sense. You can do some very simple things. You don't need to try to, cover the entire, 20 items of your last risk assessment, or 100 items, or whatever it is. Just focus on some very specific examples. We like to take things from like the top CIS controls, and just focus on some of the top controls. There are other controls and frameworks that have similar things. One example is just internal inventory, right? It doesn't have IoT, so instead of trying to take over the entire, like, hey, let's build out an entire inventory system and inventory all the hardware and software. Let's just focus on one specific component. Let's focus on IoT. Still a large component, but do we have any capabilities of doing that? Is it managed somewhere else? Does facilities manage the HVAC systems? Does a separate physical security team manage all the cameras? What else is there? Are there a bunch of other devices? Just talking through those things without having, so that's something you can talk through, get an action plan in place. And that has really nothing to do with incident response. It's just trying to say, how do we know where all these things are at? Another one that's been more common is prioritization and threat and vulnerability management. We have a lot of 0 days. We have a lot of unpatched things. What do we do? Do we turn off print spooler? Do we completely shut off our email system? What is the actual prioritization in that? And is everything always the sky is falling, or do we have some type of like main management framework and escalation path? Because we're just going to overexhaust the engineers if you just continuously go through and tell them the sky's falling and you patch everything immediately outside the maintenance windows. Another one, again, account takeover response takes too long, and thinking business email compromise, thinking other type of account takeovers, and just takes too long. There's too many manual processes, from detection to triage to actual response. How do we understand, how do we use our tooling, get more tooling, or understand that process, and the people that have the access to do those processes to shorten that process.
All right.
Other examples are taking internal issues or incidences, current events, right? So 0 day vendor patching, again, external facing. It's kind of similar to that example number 2 up there, but that's something in the news. I think we have a few news items that we're going to cover, right, Amanda?
Yep, that's coming up next. So here we go. So these are 3 that we're going to go over. We're going to do a third-party vendor that was in the news attack, why out-of-band communication is important and forgotten many times. Jeremy and I actually recently did a tabletop that we found out how many different kinds of communication some places can actually have internally, and how that is sometimes a problem also. And then also one that deals with asset inventory and secure IoT, which you kind of covered a second ago too.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one where, thinking about those, I don't call it supply chain, but more dependencies. So, even thinking about, talking about this one, but even CrowdStrike, right? There are a lot of, businesses that relied on other services upstream of other businesses that you utilize, things like CrowdStrike, or in this case, a major ISP or a major MSP got ransomware, which shut down IT services for various things, including telecom, ISP, television stations, water supply. So think about those things. More relevant probably is that the CrowdStrike, and how that had a global impact, and really thinking about, wow, how can that impact my business if one of these components affect my business operations. And the thing is that that's always going to probably happen within some type of software or some type of service. It doesn't mean that you never outsource MSPs anymore. It doesn't mean that you bring everything internal. It doesn't mean that you start building your own antivirus software. But you just have to think about, how you respond, how do you communicate when those things happen.
Yep. And then the next example is one of my favorites, talking about out-of-band communication. So this is an example back in, was 2021 or 2022, maybe. I know it wasn't terribly long ago. But when this attack group actually breached their Teams instance, and were able to take screenshots mid-breach of their IR team talking. And so this was a post that they had released based on that during the attack. And that could be really important, right? Like, that's what, if you have a Teams instance with thousands of people in it, sometimes you don't necessarily know who could potentially be in there, especially if your credentials have been captured. So during investigations and other incidents, it's really important to think about these kind of communication issues. And then the third one is the asset inventory and IoT that I know is Jeremy's favorite.
It is one of my favorites. This is an older one. I don't think I'm ever going to get rid of it in my examples because it was just too great. And many may have heard about this, but you get a fish tank installed. It was in a casino, and all of a sudden, it was put on the network, and it was used to pivot and essentially exfil an entire high rollers list and a bunch of personal information about those high rollers. And that is just like, what the scenario there, right? Um, talk about a scenario, talk with executives and get everyone kind of interested in some of this stuff. But what do you do with these type of IoT things? This stuff can happen. And it does happen now. Obviously, a casino high rollers list is probably a lot more sought out for than maybe a pizza shop's customer listing or potentially others. But the things that can happen, it's an attack vector, and this was just data exfil, but it could be anything else associated. So really have to think about these little components. That's like, oh, it just needs an internet connection, plug it in, let it out. Really, how is those set up? How is it segmented? Really have to think about those things. That's a really interesting one to get executives interested. There's a lot of media on it. It is an older one, but still very relevant.
Yeah. So then the news constantly gives us different things that we can use for tabletop exercises. I was just at an event yesterday, Secure World Detroit, and was talking to some other threat intel people about, I can never remember the name of it, but the pager devices that were exploding. And they proved like where that was actually coming from. So like you can go into any of the like research that has been done about those threats in the news. Sometimes companies release their own incident reports, and you can go into that and kind of take some of that internally. So yeah, any of these examples are great ones to kind of throw pieces and parts into your discussion points when you're trying to come up with something like that. All right, and then we have another one, which is almost all happens all the time. It's still one of the top ways that attackers can get inside a system is business email compromise. So again, like we talked about earlier, we don't like reading something from slides, but this is one that the actual scenarios are ones that we always read from. These should also, a lot of times it helps to actually pass these papers out, right? So you put the scenario on a paper, you pass it out to everybody that's involved. Granted, we cannot send it to everybody that's on this webinar, but you can see it on the screen. So it's almost as good. Take a screenshot or something. So Henry received an email directing him to update his password on the organization's Plunder and Prosper financial website. After clicking the link in the email, entering his credentials, and updating his password, everything seemed just fine. That is, until he was confronted about a large authorization executed from his treasure chest that he had no recollection of. As it turns out, the link in the email directed him to an evil twin website where a malicious actor was able to compromise his credentials. All right, then what are we going to do?
Right. So like think about this on the, from a business email compromise perspective, what tools can you leverage? What tools do you have? Do you have an inventory of tools? There's been, a few places that, the engineering team has, if they get, notified of this, they do it one way, the security team does it another way, the service desk does it another way, or help desk. So you want to make sure that you all know the tools that you can leverage, which ones can respond faster. And then, overall, if you're a small organization, can a provider or vendor offer additional support? How does that function? Do you need some type of help? Do you have those support contacts available? Um, does your staff even feel comfortable with this from the sender type if it's genuine, right? Maybe somehow it was, I don't say it would be legitimate, but maybe it was an odd request. There's a lot of organizations out there that have a lot of employees that don't really communicate well through email, don't use technology much, and don't look kind of regularly like spam or phishing. So what is that? How do you verify? How do you validate that? Does the staff feel okay calling that person and having that conversation, especially if it's a VIP? It goes kind of without saying, does the organization provide the end user training or phishing awareness, right? That's something that you might go down a rabbit hole and you might kind of table, because you can go down that and somebody can go on tangent saying, well, if no one's ever trained, we're never going to be able to respond to anything. Maybe not untrue, but you might want to focus that. So this is an example of maybe you leave that question out, or maybe you focus only on that one. And it goes kind of to the next question, right? Multi-factor solves a lot of things. The next version of that is the phishing resistant authentication. So you can maybe have focus on that. Sometimes these questions might be too broad. You might want to scope them down.
Yeah, you can go into very specific questions about the technologies that you implement. One of the things that we see a lot with how business email compromise is successful is because a lot of the upper management don't want to do it, so they just refuse. And we've just had many times where the organization itself has rolled out two-factor authentication, but the top targeted people are the ones that could say no. And a lot of times that doesn't make a lot of friends when you try and force people like that into security that they don't like. But showing these risks through a tabletop can really help prior to the business email compromise happening.
And so the other thing that I kind of touched on as well is communication protocols, right? So, um, how do you have different severity levels of who you notify? Do you notify everybody every time there's a phishing to a few people, to a lot of people? You know, do you notify people outside your organization? Do you have a protocol for that? Do you work through your legal or counsel or some type of senior management? And then, you know, kind of like as a separate thing, how do you, prevent, if you have something that happens and you have another, evil twin website, right? So we've seen some phishing attempts that will go and actually link to an actual masqueraded website of another organization that looks just like yours. We've seen that, from a government perspective. We've seen that from a law enforcement perspective. So, how do you combat that? We kind of have as developers in there because it's maybe another facet of IT that you want to include. Can they put some type of scripting on the website to see if websites are cloned here and there? There's some things you can do. I'll give like a shout out to some of the canary tokens. You can do some code snippets. Don't want to get too much into the details, but you can do certain things on the website to see if your websites are getting cloned, around and masqueraded. So it's just something to take back.
Think if anybody has any questions, we can get to Q&A now. I'll talk a little bit about, I have to put on my salesy hat, even though I'm not very good at it, and talk about, well, if I can get it to move. Another way that you can kind of, I tried to spin this into playbook creation, a way that you can come up with playbook TTX ideas is we just released a domain security assessment that you can put your domain in, and it's emailed you a cool summary of the kind of external vulnerabilities that your domain is seeing right now. So I found out some cool things about some of my domains that I kind of forgot about. But yeah, you can use things like this. So you can also use internal vulnerability scans. You can use, if you've gotten any information from like a vendor, anything like that, you can use. So I had to kind of throw on my product marketing hat for that one.
Does that uses AI?
It does. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Our CTO wrote it. He's AI. I don't want to call him a fanatic. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. He's very good at doing AI related things. So this is all AI generated on the back end. Plugs into a lot of different services, but
Very interesting.
yeah.
And as Amanda just said, if you have questions, please add those in the Q&A section there. We did get a couple that came in during the presentation. The first one, I believe, was actually a comment that was shared while we were talking about how to work with difficult personalities when you're trying to conduct these exercises. Someone said, oftentimes when that happens in my experience, it's because the person saying these things, especially from a tech perspective, believes they know more than the person who wrote the slides. I tend to fix it by asking what would happen if that person were away or on holiday or a plane and how everyone would handle it. Our first question here, which kind of dovetails nicely with that comment, how do we handle internal culture complications to running tabletop exercises? People in our organization can be hesitant to acknowledge something under their control might be a liability. How do we start that conversation?
Go ahead, Jeremy. I talked a little bit about it, but
Yeah, so that's going to change from organization to organization, and really just trying to build those relationships and start small. Maybe share a few scenarios around with some of the different teams, get them involved, get them trying to build out scenarios to, I call it like stump the bands, but get them a little interested in that, and then go from there and just start real small, get different people. Sometimes you want to maybe mix some personalities. Maybe those personalities to kind of to have in the room to start with, and then build that organically. Certain organizational cultures are really, against, not having the answer for things, or having, issues found out, or people that are wrong. So you really have to just go through, very, um, like have a strategy around that to start with maybe some of your own scenarios or some of your own things. I think Amanda talked about, pick some of your own pain points, start with those, and maybe people feel a little bit more comfortable to share some of their issues, or a little bit more honest.
I think starting out in small groups too can help. Um, it's easier conversation flow when you're just starting out with a small group, and it gives you practice to kind of deal with those situations too. Um, we recommend you can start with just your group, right? If you have a security group, you can just do that and walk through stuff, and then you can start adding in, external groups as you go, until you can get to. Sometimes we do even larger tabletops, right? That last several days. It's just, something that you kind of have to work up to sometimes.
The next question we got here, amazingly, I think you already have a slide up to help answer it. That was, how do we come up with more scenarios? How do we come up with additional scenarios?
Yeah, that's another one. And then I'll probably steal a little bit of Zoe's thunder, but we have two more of these that we're going to do after this, that the dates will be released going forward. But we'll get into more specific tabletops that we can run. We also have a full list that we'll end up sharing of different tabletops that map to different like NIST standards. And yeah, a whole bunch of stuff. So just keep a lookout for that. I don't know. Can you think of any other? I mean, there's other websites that provide different tabletops. There's a couple like social media accounts that will post ideas on tabletops. I can't remember the name of the one that I follow off the top of my head, but
Yeah,
do you have any other ideas?
there's a few Twitter accounts that have the tabletop scenarios. They release them weekly. They're just
Yeah,
little one sentence things.
Actors and
We
Breaches.
Backdoors and Breaches, another great game, great tool, that has a lot of different scenarios. And we have, I think, how many do we have, Amanda?
50-ish, maybe more.
Yeah, 50 or 60 scenarios. And I think at the we'll start going through a lot of those different ones in the later webcast.
And I see one more question here about how to get executive buy-in for
Yeah,
I
so
yeah.
getting executive buy-in, you have to start speaking their language, depending on the organization. We briefly mentioned creating like a project charter and getting a lot of formal documentation, and then being able to share like quarterly um, use cases and value add. So when you're recording all of those short-term goals and those long-term goals, as you're completing those goals and completing, or addressing gaps in the organization, you can share those high levels. So those high level completions, so the executives can see value in that, right? So that might be a quarterly report that comes through and says, hey, we've done 15 tabletop exercises this quarter. We've addressed 22 short-term gaps. They might not, unfortunately, care about what those were, but they see the numbers, and they see that you're addressing things, and maybe you have some type of ratings for those, and they see value in that. And that's where you have to meet the executives in the middle and show value add and summarize it, and not do some type of, IT word vomit to them, and they're not going to listen after the first, couple minutes. So you have to, speak their language, get the formal charter, get some summary information, and give them some type of executive, overview of what you're doing, what you're completing, and how it shows value to the organization.
Excellent. Giving folks just one last moment, but I believe that that is it. We have gotten through our questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining today. I want to thank Jeremy and Amanda for sharing all of this helpful information. Please, to our attendees, keep an eye on your email. We will be sending out a link to the recording of today's session once we're able to get it up, which will be either later today or tomorrow. We will also be following up, as Amanda mentioned, once we have confirmed dates for our second and third session. And guys, I believe the third of those sessions is planned to be kind of interactive, more of a roundtable format, right? As a little sneak peek of what's to come. So if you found today helpful, if you're looking to further evolve your approach to running tabletop organization exercises in your organization, or who have questions about them, please stay tuned. We have more to come. With that, I'll pass it back to our speakers. Any final thoughts that you want to leave our attendees with today?
Let me think here.
Amanda, do you want to plug mental health hackers?
Oh, yeah,
Sure.
that's a good one.
Yeah. So if those of you that don't know, I'm the CEO of Mental Health Hackers. We've been an organization that helps with the stigma around mental health in information security and just tech in general for the last since 2018. And we're always looking for volunteers and places to run our villages for conferences. So anybody interested, just hit me up, mentalhealthhackers.org.
All right.
What about you?
Well,
What do you want to?
That's all. That was mine
Anything?
right there.
Oh, okay. All right.
all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We hope you have a great afternoon and found this helpful, and we hope to see you on another Blue Mirror webinar very soon. Have a great day, all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.